course, as always, I am your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And welcome to a month of Hitchcock.
Alfred Hitchcock presents Alfred Hitchcock Month. Except Alfred Hitchcock isn't presenting it because he's no longer with us, God rest his soul.
And also, we don't have that type of leverage. We couldn't pull that even if we wanted to. I mean, granted, now we would need to be a living god, but, you know.
Even if the man was like a lich and still making movies, he was a movie lich, he would not deign to come on this podcast.
No, we make too many fart jokes and anime references for any man, honestly. We deserve nothing. If you are listening to this, that is more than we deserve, and we apologize.
I don't apologize.
I apologize. We watched Rear Window this week, and this is going to be an interesting episode for a lot of reasons.
There's a lot to unpack here today, gang. Let's go ahead and strap in for this one. I guess we should start with the context of maybe I should start with why I selected this movie, because I've made our Hitchcock month syllabus more or less.
Yeah, I mean that's actually a really good place to even just start, which is why are we doing Hitchcock month? Why are we doing these movies?
So we're doing Hitchcock month because I love Alfred Hitchcock. I took a class, one of my favorite classes that I've ever taken in undergrad. Learned a lot about criticism, learned a lot about writing, just, studying one of the greats. And the professor was like, peak English professor, grumpy old white dude with a big mustache and a brown coat with a lot of sardonic quips. So it was great. It was a great class. I loved it.
Sounds wonderful.
So I had not seen much Hitchcock before this class. We watched probably like 10 to 12 films, including most of his most famous ones. There are a couple of the big like canon movies that I haven't seen. But I like to think that I have a pretty good grasp on Alfred Hitchcock and what he was about. I have been meaning to revisit these movies. I haven't watched any of them since probably junior year of college or whenever that would have been, somewhere around then. And Sean, as I understand it, you've only seen one Hitchcock film, which was a similar position I was in before I took this class. Granted, the one Hitchcock film I saw was North by Northwest, which is one of my favorite Hitchcock films, and that is not the one that you have seen.
No, I saw The Birds in a high school class populated pretty much entirely with my friends, in which the teacher was one of my closest friends' moms. So we made fun of it the entire time, which is, I mean, it's The Birds. We are tentatively going to be doing that movie towards the end of the month. And I'm curious to go back to it knowing what I know now and, with some courtesy for Alfred Hitchcock as opposed to somebody who is just making fun of a movie about birds. So my experience with Alfred Hitchcock, to put it simply, is not great, and I blame myself mostly.
I mean, I don't really blame you, because if The Birds is just the first one that you're exposed to, that's not a great first impression. I'm comfortable saying that right now.
I mean, it was also 10 years ago for what it's worth. Like, this was literally a decade ago that I saw an Alfred Hitchcock film. So I am functionally coming in here with no understanding of Alfred Hitchcock at all. I remember, like, flashes from a couple scenes, and part of that could just be there's a Bob's Burgers episode about the birds that I am conflating it with. We'll find out when we watch The Birds, but for now, that's what you need to know for me.
Yeah, and so I, as the, between the two of us at least, the Hitchcock expert, so to speak, between the two of us strictly, I'm not claiming to be a real expert.
I was gonna say, I don't think either one of us can be claimed to be an expert in anything. You can claim to be a master in English, in fiction.
Yes.
Expert is a stretch, I would say.
I'd say expert is a stretch. hopefully come back in like 10 years and I've published a bunch of books and can then rub it in everyone's face. But for now, I think expert is a stretch.
Hi, 10 years in the future, people who have found this podcast. How's the future? Hopefully not like the present, because right now everything is awful.
Oh, yeah.
June 2020 is going to be a month, y'all. Calling it now.
But while we're not thinking about, the fall of modern society, and the second rise of fascism in the Western world, let's turn our attention to Alfred Hitchcock. Should I explain what movies I have picked for and my rationale, or can that wait?
Do you think it would improve our audience's understanding of how we're going through this month, or do you think it's more fun to be a surprise?
I think that there's some value in seeing the method to my madness. So we have 4 weeks of Hitchcock,
potentially a 5th, depending on how we're feeling at the end of it.
Yeah. So Sean's only stipulation was that he wanted to rewatch The Birds and give it a reassessment, which is fair enough. So right now, the tentative schedule is obviously Rear Window this week, Psycho next week, Vertigo the week after that, and then wrapping up with The Birds, because Vertigo is probably Hitchcock's headiest movie, and The Birds is probably his least heady movie. So that's a nice contrast.
And if you know anything about the podcast, you know that when I spend too much time talking about things smart, I get upset because I haven't said fuck enough, and so I occasionally need to say fuck. That's what The Birds is for.
We need to give Sean a little bit of rope here, to go wild like a mad dog with his fucks.
Yeah. Because otherwise, what am I even doing here? Expanding my cinema knowledge, being a better person through a greater understanding of cinema. All that stuff is lame if I'm not spewing explicitives all the time. Expletives, not explicitives. I can't talk. It's cool.
So for the rationale on why I chose those 3, starting with Rear Window this week, because I feel like this movie is kind of peak Hitchcock in a lot of ways, an opinion that has been reaffirmed upon me rewatching it. More on that when we actually talk about the film. Psycho next week, because it's one of the landmarks of cinema. I was torn between Psycho and North by Northwest. If we do have time and Sean's still up for it, maybe we'll do North by Northwest after The Birds. But I decided to go with Psycho because it's the slightly more culturally famous one, and I just think Sean would probably enjoy it more. So that's why we're going with Psycho. And then Vertigo is maybe my favorite Hitchcock film. Although I really liked, spoiler alert, I still really love Rear Window, so that's a contender. But Vertigo, I feel like I didn't want to jump right into Vertigo because it is a lot slower, a lot more methodical, and very different from a typical Hitchcock movie.
So you didn't want to start with the one that I would like, is what you're saying.
No, I didn't want this to be a once upon a time in Hollywood situation, because like that movie, I think Vertigo is greatly improved by having some familiarity with the author. I think it's one of those that's impossible to disentangle. So
okay.
That's why we're saving Vertigo for last before The Birds.
The hesitation speaks volume about what's to come with The Birds. Oh boy. So I want to talk a little bit about something that's kind of on my mind, and something that we've been kind of dealing with Quarantine Classics, but haven't really had to come face to face with until now. And that is what I am dubbing Great Expectations. Not the book, the expectations that you have when you're watching something that is considered a cornerstone of cinema. In that we've watched Citizen Kane, Casablanca, Doctor Strangelove, Akira Kurosawa films, Seven Samurai. I mean, we've gone through some deep fucking quarantine classics. And every single time we've come out the other side being like, wow, I completely understand why these are great. There's some interesting content to them. They're bringing up some interesting questions, some interesting themes, ideas. And with Casablanca, it's even a crowd pleaser, but there's still some depth to it, some stuff to chew on with it. And so when you get to Hitchcock, and this is it's something I should also really put strongly out there. My opinion of Hitchcock, I am going to say right now, is going to change over the course of this podcast. So if you're listening to this now and then you jump to Psycho or Vertigo or The Birds and I sound completely different, that's why. My knowledge of Hitchcock will expand. It's important. We should normalize changing your opinion with new information. That's a thing that we should do.
It's a journey. This whole podcast is a journey, but particularly this month for Sean, it's a journey.
So, going into Rear Window, I had a lot of expectations for what it was going to be. For some reason, first and foremost, I thought it was about a car in some capacity. It's not at all. That's not really anything, but it's just an interesting anecdote about my expectations for Rear Window. But I was also expecting it to be a lot headier, as we call the more thinky movies. It's not. And before our cinephiles jump off and get mad at me or stop listening or whatever, I do want to say that it's a very good movie. I'm not here to diss Rear Window in that regard. It's incredibly well made. The directing is absolutely immaculate. Every shot was wonderful. I loved the panning through the set. The set itself was absolutely gorgeous. Everything about it is a marvel of filmmaking. Jackson referred to it as a building block upon which most modern films are built, and it's completely, yes, entirely. So I don't want to come in here just sounding like I'm knocking Rear Window right off the bat. But let me knock Rear Window a little bit, given my expectations and ideas and basically who I am as a person going into the film. In that this film kind of drove me nuts. And throughout most of it, I had assumed that it was incredibly intentional. I was like, okay, I hate these characters, but I fully believe that this is what Hitchcock wants me to do. I know he's a master of the craft. I'm expected to dislike these characters he's playing with, protagonists and whether you should like your protagonist or not. And there's all sorts of brilliance underlying that. And I want to watch that movie. That I got really excited about that. But B, that's not really what the movie is. And I kind of do want to rewatch it with that in mind and see if I can kind of come around a little bit more on it. Because again, it's a very good, well-made movie. But when you're going into it with certain expectations, I feel like the movie doesn't deliver on those expectations, because why would it? You're going into it with expectations that have no precedent for them to be there. So that's kind of the short and skinny of it. The little bit more of the extended version of it is that I thought the film was going to go one way. As I was watching it, the ending then did not go the way I thought it was going to do. I ended up coming away enjoying the ending in my head more than the ending of the film, because I thought it would raise more interesting questions than what I was seeing at the time. And I genuinely felt that the ending, from my perspective of the film, was very out of nowhere and kind of incongruous with the rest of the film. Now, again, the only other Hitchcock film I'd seen was The Birds, and I did not give it a fair shake in high school. Completely true. No denying that. So, knowing what I know about Hitchcock a few weeks from now, I might look back at this and go, okay, wait, I need to rewatch this and get a better understanding for it. But just so you all know where I'm coming in from it, kind of drove me nuts on this watch.
Yeah, I think it'd be valuable. I could see you just not jiving with this one, upon returning to it, but I think it'd be a valuable thing to do once our experiment here is over. And for the record, I really love Rear Window. It's probably one of my favorites. Great. I think it's a great movie. I think that there's a lot of great stuff going on, especially in the details and the visuals. So let's talk about those expectations for a bit, because I had a somewhat similar reaction the first time I watched a Hitchcock movie, the first time I saw North by Northwest. Now, granted, that was a spectacular experience because the museum local to where I was living in Iowa at the time would do like classic movies every week. So I got like a big IMAX screen of like a classic film with a lot of great set pieces, and it was just a magical experience. But like as for the actual movie, I kind of found myself being like, is this what Alfred Hitchcock is? Like I feel like I'm missing something here, or like that it's not as spectacular as sort of culturally I've sort of been built up to think. And that's kind of a whole conversation that even before we start talking about the specifics of Rear Window, I just want to address here, because Hitchcock's public persona, I think, is very important in understanding his films and sort of understanding what role his films were playing in the development of the medium. Because it's not, you're right in that overall, not to say that Hitchcock's films aren't smart overwhelmingly. I think they're very smart. But they're smart in a, if I had to make a comparison, and this might sound weird, I think that Hitchcock is most comparable to like a Steven Spielberg as far as like a contemporary director goes, in that he's less interested in like having sort of a grand vision and is more interested in sort of the nuts and bolts mechanics of story and drama and like getting you involved in the characters, hence the Master of Suspense title. Now Hitchcock, he had a long career, he made a lot of movies, and in many ways his most famous movie, Psycho, is not very indicative of what he's like as a whole. More on that next week. So I think the thing about him is that like, you know, he's not really like a Stanley Kubrick type. Like Kubrick, you know, it kind of has the reputation as like a mad genius, which Hitchcock also has, but that isn't so much like comes across in the content of the movies themselves for the most part. We're gonna get to Vertigo eventually, Hitchcock fans, don't you worry. So what was Hitchcock's role in cinema then? Like what's so special about him? First, I think is just that, you know, how much of a mastery he has over like visual language and the camera and like the mechanics of telling a story visually. Like that's where like the real artistry comes through more so than the writing. Like if we're comparing him to Spielberg, who are, you know, very different directors in a lot of ways in terms of like tone and subject matter and, you know, what they are interested in, they're very similar in that they're both like highly visual directors with a focus on mostly straightforward drama with not a lot to do with the writing. They are not generally known as being writers. They tend to pick projects which fit their sensibilities. And so I think that's important to note, because basically the argument around Hitchcock is that because he's famous for making a lot of crowd pleasers, making a lot of, you know, the equivalent of like, you know, blockbusters in his day, it's more that when people reevaluated Hitchcock, it's because at first he was being dismissed as kind of like how we see like a Michael Bay. Like, I mean, not to that extreme, but like, oh, like Hitchcock, he doesn't make like real important movies like Citizen Kane. Like he makes, you know, fun, enjoyable thrillers for a broad audience. You know, this is my understanding, and from what I'm remembering from like my reading and my research and stuff, you know, it's been a while. Let me preface everything I'm saying with that. But generally, I think this is the idea. So then come like, you know, the new wave of like French criticism, cahiers du cinéma, auteur theory of filmmaking. Hitchcock starts to get a reevaluation when a lot of people start saying, well, wait a minute, like basically just because Hitchcock isn't like writing the movies themselves and they're not like, you know, extremely obtuse, you know, sort of features, that doesn't mean that there isn't artistry going on in here. And that doesn't mean that Hitchcock as a director doesn't have a very particular voice. You know, so goes auteur theory that proposes the author as sort of the central, the director, as sort of the central author of a film, which, you know, people can continue to argue with, but that was like the new development at the time. So I think step one to really enjoying what Hitchcock is about is to take a step back from the expectation that this is going to be like a 2001 or like even a Citizen Kane, which is a lot more like artsy. Even though Citizen Kane has a lot of like sort of classic drama too, it plays a lot more around with like structure. The visuals are weird basically because Orson Welles had a blank check to do whatever he wanted with that movie, and so that was like pure youthful energy, like breaking new ground in a way that could only be done by someone kind of taking control for themselves. Whereas Hitchcock was so much more concerned with generally entertaining an audience. The artistry from a Hitchcock movie comes in the details. It comes from the camera work. It comes from the way he frames things. It comes from like a lot of the visual details and the symbols, and just sort of placing the movies in like a broader cultural context as well as a broader context of his own work, because that's the other thing, is that Hitchcock, pretty unusually, even now, had a very public persona. He, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, he had his own show. He'd like show up in his trailers to explain his movies, and the man was just as iconic, if not more so, than the movies that he made. Again, there's a pretty good example of this directly that we're going to talk about next week with Psycho. But for now, that's something to keep in mind, is that this, if you even can do such a thing as separate the artist from the art, like, leaving that debate aside, Hitchcock is definitely not a filmmaker where you can realistically do that. And so that is why we come to Rear Window, and that I think that this is, like I said, I think this is peak Hitchcock. I think that this showcases a lot of his strengths, a lot of his hangups, a lot of what makes him interesting as a filmmaker that I hope to make a case for today for our good friend Sean. That said, when we do get more into the details, I do understand where he's coming from, and maybe we can, meet in the middle here and learn something about ourselves and each other.
No.
Oh.
Spoilers.
Spoiler time.
Cool. Before we do, next week we're going to be talking about Psycho.
Psycho.
Man, we just spent a whole time talking about this, and my brain is just, not in it. Next week we're going to be talking about Psycho. If you're enjoying the podcast, iTunes, leave us a review, tell your friends, follow us on Twitter at BADHcast, patreon.com/BADH_cast if you want to support us. Bunch of bonus episodes over there. Great, good, let's go.
Let's go.
Cool. I want to talk about why these characters drove me nuts and my general experience with the film. And hopefully this will kind of set the stage for everything else that goes on here, because this film, I'm sure, has been talked to death from the, regular perspective a lot. So here's a different perspective, I guess, kind of. So I was watching this movie with the idea that our main characters, our main window watchers, were wrong. That our detective was in fact the person who was correct in this film, and that basically the suspense came from watching these people slowly unravel and like do riskier and stupider things to prove that someone is committed a murder when they actually haven't, all the while missing the fact that their downstairs neighbor, Miss Lonely Hearts, I believe is what she's referred to, is getting closer and closer to committing suicide. And so at the end of the movie, when it turns out that, upstairs dude did in fact kill his wife, I was just like, hang on, wait, really? That's the payoff here? We've been led from everything we've seen to believe that he didn't kill his wife, and ended up in, like, it was all a misunderstanding, which, in my opinion, makes a lot of sense. Like, you're watching this thing happen from across the way, you're only getting so much of the story, you're missing whole swaths of things that are going on. There's important chunks where, like, between the windows you cannot see what is going on, and like that is an important element to the film itself. Like there are spots that you cannot see what is happening and the blinds can be drawn. So I was very much in the opinion that our window watchers were in the wrong here. I was trusting the detective. It's important to note, I guess, right now, how that sounds. I was just trying to put my head in the 50s thing, and like I was given no reason not to trust the detective. In the language of the film, I was just believing him. It's not to say I'm supporting what the cops are doing right now in any way, shape, or form. I just feel that's worth saying right now, given that I'm expressing sympathies for a cop. It's a bad look right now. That's what it boils down to. But when they get to the end then, and it turns out that the cop was wrong and that they were right and this dude killed his wife, and like the Miss Lonely Hearts was basically a red herring in a lot of ways, I felt kind of betrayed because I was working up this whole theme in my mind of like, you know, we are inventing things that are happening to make our own lives more exciting in the lives of other people, and in doing so are missing the things that are, you know, actively happening in the world. The truth of what is going on, which I mean, honestly could be a metaphor for a lot of stuff happening today. You know, we're focusing on the small stuff and overlooking a lot of major issues, which leads to, you know, protests and whatnot. So I explain that stuff mostly because I'm trying to explain where we're at in the world right now and why my headspace might have been there, and kind of explain why I was expecting the movie to end that way. To further back up my point, there is a bit of Hitchcock lore in which he talks about planting a bomb under a table and the way that filmmaking will set up the bomb being planted there. People come in, set the bomb up. A couple comes in and has a conversation over the table. There's a bomb underneath it. The camera cuts to the bomb to remind them that it's there. The tension rises more, and then it goes off. You know, setup, reminder, payoff. That's a core tenet of filmmaking, of comedy, of everything. It is central to filmmaking. This is something that Jackson brought up in our pre-discussion, and I think it actually, he did so in kind of a defense of Hitchcock's style of filmmaking, but I think it also kind of defends the point that I was seeing from this, in that there is a setup of the introduction of Miss Lonely Hearts, someone who is sitting by herself, drinking herself to sleep. There is a reminder when she is sexually assaulted that she is in dire straits. And then I assumed the payoff was going to be the suicide because we see her getting prepared for a suicide. And then it cuts away from that to focus on the chaos around the man who murdered his wife. So my assumption here was that, you know, the focus would be on all of that, and then we'd cut back and be like, oh shit, you know, we saw that she was doing this, but we ignored it to focus on our own elements of life. And then when that didn't happen, it felt weird given what I had seen as the setup, reminder, and payoff. This also can be applied to the neighbor, the newlyweds as they come in. When we see them walk in, you know, they're kissing, being all lovely. They close the blinds. There's your setup. Your reminder, or at second setup, if you want to play it that way, is the fact that when his nurse comes in, she says something like, oh, you know, their blinds are open. Why would you suspect that they did anything? What about that window over there where the blinds are down? And then we see some reminders from there where we'd cut over to that, and the husband would open it, and then the wife would yell, and he'd kind of look agitated and have to go in. And so like that felt like a continuous reminder that might be the actual situation going on here, and that they're missing the murder happening in that window for focusing on something that's not actually there. So like I think that there's a really interesting idea in this film, had the ending been different, about the ideas and impact we put on other people's lives when we're only getting bits of it, as opposed to focusing on the truth and caring about those who are actively in need. But instead we get a movie that ends with them being right, which feels hollow, when I think that there is a lot of really powerful stuff that can be done if you followed my ending, which sounds bad as I say it out loud, because I'm basically saying, hey, this mastercraft in filmmaking is bad, and my version, a hack idiot, is better. But I think that there's just more theme and idea in that I really am into, and I think it kind of helps explain some of my discomfort with watching these people basically spend their lives watching something that probably isn't happening before it ends up that, oh, just kidding, it actually did happen. So that's my experience with Rear Window in a very, very long nutshell.
Yeah. So I think like I see where you're coming from on this one, and I think it's funny because I think that the movie agrees that the spying that Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly are doing is kind of bad and unethical. But I think
The movie, you don't need to think that the movie does that. The movie definitely does that. Like, it asks the questions.
it does. But I think the reason they think it's bad is different than what you were picking up on, and the elements that you were more concerned with. So I think for you, it basically comes down to like your point of view doesn't really click with the movies, because this is the way that I see the movie, because the way that I see it, like everything like stacks on top of one another and culminates perfectly with all sorts of setups and stuff, because I think that the overall theme of the movie, the point of view that it's coming from, is the idea that the windows and the apartments represent these like separate little worlds that everyone is like sort of living in, completely oblivious to all of the other ones around them. And Jimmy Stewart's character is involved only insofar as that like he's just sort of sitting back and watching what happens, more or less for his own amusement. Much has been made out of, as far as like scholarship, the fact that he's a photographer and is often pointing a camera at these windows, which are often framed like TV screens, and the fact that he's just like sitting around all day. So there's some like visual metaphors going on with the idea that this is kind of what we're doing when we're just sitting back like watching television or movies or something.
It's a very easy one to follow through, even with some of the dialogue, given that they refer to it as entertainment a lot of times and like very much treat it like someone who is sitting around watching TV. Like there was a lot of dialogue that I got that felt like it was very much drawing a parallel between what he is doing and watching TV. So like that is definitely, I completely see where people are getting that at.
And so I think that did I cut you off?
No, I just said getting that at, and then realized how stupid I sounded saying getting that at. Listen, I hate this podcast because I will say like smart things and like have a really good cogent idea, and then I will end sentences by going things that they said at.
Well, we are talking off the cuff. So.
I mean, I know, I'm well aware, but the problem is like I don't think about it in time, and so like it'll be like a couple seconds later, and I don't have I'm not gonna go back and edit it to make it sound like I'm smarter than I am. You all know I'm stupid. I'm just gonna live in my bliss.
Oh, amazing. But anyway, regarding the movie's point of view, is that like I think that the thing with the Lonely Heart subplot is that is resolved in like a happier way, like when the characters like intervene, like and like when the community, like from the outside, when something that's going on in another like closed off little window is like the music is drifting down, and like that gives her enough pause, and eventually off screen we see like gives her the courage to go say hi to this person, and that like presumably as implied by just like the framing, go on to live like a happier, less lonely life, because she's not living in her little TV box. And by that metric, I think that the overall theme is less don't be a peeping Tom and spy on people. I think it's more along the lines of like, evil triumphs when good people do nothing, that sort of thing. And that the meddling, the more that they meddle, the more that they take direct action, is seen more positively by the movie, as opposed to just sort of kicking back and watching and like getting themselves involved. And this is made pretty explicit with the scene with the dog, where the lady, the quirky outside mattress lady who has the dog that she lowers in the basket, when
adorable as an aside.
Oh, it's adorable. It's so sad. It's because when Thorwald kills the dog to cover it up because the dog's been sniffing around his flower beds where he buried evidence. Like, she makes a speech much to this effect. Like, all you, like, assholes just, like, sit around, like, what has this dog done to you? Like, stuff along that way. And then everyone, and, more visually, and this is one of the reasons that, like, I love Hitchcock so much, is that immediately after, like, the piano guy's having a party, and, like, people come out, and there's like, whatever. Like, yeah, that sucks, but we're gonna go back retreating into our boxes again because this doesn't affect us. And I think looking at it through that lens, as well as just the more typical, like, Hitchcock master of suspense stuff, I think that the movie works really beautifully. So, as far as, like, setups, you raise a valid point as far as the setups of the Miss Lonely Heart stuff. I do think it pays off, just in a different way. But I think that, like, the overall feeling, this is where the more, like, blockbustery, like, crowd pleaser stuff comes in, is that, he wants you to feel that tension when Grace Kelly is entering the apartment and, like, sneaking around, and you see Thorwald coming up the stairs, and he tries to, like, signal to her, but he can't, and, like, she's sort of, like, playing along to try and outwit him until, like, the police arrive, and that sort of stuff. And I think that's the sort of thing that Hitchcock does really well. And I think that this movie is a great example of that, really helped by what makes this movie stand out so much, even amongst a lot of great, like, Hitchcock thrillers, is the visuals, the micro stories going on in the various windows, and just the overall framework. Although, I think, central to that is that you do have to like the characters, and I like the characters a lot. And I think that, like, if you can't clear that hurdle, that's where the buck stops there with the movie, I think.
See, I the thing is, though, is that I didn't dislike the characters. I just didn't trust what they were saying. Like, I think that there's a difference in that regard. Like, I think that the characters were good. I enjoyed them. I think that, like, even Grace Kelly in her, very clearly trying to show that she is willing to go with him to go out in the world and pack a single suitcase and all that good stuff. Like, I think that there's something to be said even then, that, like, she is seeing things that aren't there in an effort to create this, idea that she is willing to go with him. And I don't think, like, I don't fault either of the characters for this. I don't think that they're inherently reprehensible for wanting this perspective. I mean, it's shitty that they want this man to have murdered his wife, absolutely, and they wrestle with that themselves. But there's also just, like, her desire comes from a place of love. His comes from a place of being cooped up in a house for 6 weeks. Like, it is understandable perspectives as to why they are where they're at. So, like, I was never like, oh, these people are assholes. It was just like, I didn't trust them more than anything.
And I mean, that can be a hard thing to broach. I do want to talk about, like, the particular dynamic of this relationship, because I really enjoyed it, and I think that there's some interesting stuff going on with regards to, like, feminist analysis of Hitchcock, which is a big thing. Hitchcock's famous, like, torment of Tippi Hedren on The Birds, and like, that sort of Stanley Kubrick, psychologically torturing Shelley Duvall thing is pretty famous. So naturally, that's gotten a lot of attention in scholarship. Hitchcock has a weird relationship with women.
Yeah, there's definitely some 1950s stuff coming through in here, to put it lightly. It feels like there's some decent stuff in here, but also some stuff that, you just kind of tug the shirt collar a little bit, like, oh, we're doing this, huh? Oh, okay, cool.
Well, yeah, there is a lot of, like, 50 stuff that definitely is, like, tugging at the shirt collar, but I think the core, like, through line of the movie and, like, that relationship, I mean, I don't know, I think it works really well, and I think that
no, I agree. As I said, I like the two of them. I think the through line between them was good. I was more just saying that, like, agreeing with your sentiment that he clearly has an interesting relationship with women in his films,
yes,
and that he clearly has some hang-ups, shall we say.
Yeah, and that's something we're going to be talking about more and more, because that's going to be very important for Vertigo. But with this film, at least, one, like, I just wanted to, talk about the particulars for a bit, because the way that it starts off, and like, it starts off with their relationship, like Jimmy Stewart being kind of an ass about it, like, being down on it, and like, oh yeah, like she's too perfect, like she's not exciting enough for me, and like, he's saying this to, wacky comic relief nurse character Stella. And, she's trying to tell him, like, oh, you're just, being an ass, like, she's too good for you, like, that sort of thing. But, like, when they actually sit down and, like, have that argument, and, like, she's kind of going above and beyond to, like, impress him, and he's, just not being into it because he's, being kind of a jerk as a result of being cooped up and, like, all this other stuff. Like, when that argument breaks out, and, like, he is talking about, like, oh, I've got all these dreams and ambitions. I can't just, like, sit around in America. Like, I need to go, but, like, you can't come with me because you're, like, a high society gal, and, like, you wouldn't be doing this. And she's frustrated that he doesn't have any faith in her, that, like, she'd actually be able to do that. And so spends the movie, like, a lot of the movie, and this is where some of the, like, the problematic elements come in, and that it's a very one-sided thing, and that she kind of has to earn his approval by going and doing the dangerous stuff and, like, leaving the note and sneaking into the apartment. But on the other hand, I think that one thing that this movie does really well, and it as far as making me buy that relationship, is just one that, like, even though their lives are, like, heightened, they're, like, celebrities, she's, like, a model, he's, like, a war photographer that's won, like, Pulitzers and stuff or whatever. But, that core argument, I mean, I've had arguments like that in relationships, like, when you have two people whose, goals don't necessarily align, and you're trying to do the hard work of, like, making it work, and maybe one party is more interested in making it work than the other, or stuff along those lines. I think it's very well done and very realistic, and I think that Hitchcock doesn't get enough credit for his character writing sometimes. I mean, in the like, grand intelligentsia, he does. That's kind of the point of his, reevaluation as a filmmaker, like, back in the 60s or whenever that would have been. But, like, I think it's worth bearing that it is very strong. Like, he does a lot with not much. And I think that with regards to the more, like, particular, like, feminism side of things, even though, like, she does kind of, like, spend the movie trying to get Jimmy Stewart's approval, whereas he, like, doesn't have to work as hard to kind of meet her halfway. I do like that the movie doesn't reject her femininity. This is not the kind of movie, like, he even makes a quip about her high heels, like, like in Jurassic World, where that was a big scene, and that was a very played out sort of thing of, like, I'm gonna, kind of reject my femininity because it's not badass, and I'm in, like, a badass world of dinosaurs. I mean, the last shot of the movie is, like, her kind of picking up the magazine about the Himalayas, and she's reading it, and then after she sees Jimmy Stewart's asleep, she puts it down, and she picks up another fashion magazine and starts reading that, and that, like, she still really, like, embraces that side of her femininity, that she doesn't have to reject that just because she's gonna go off, like, on these adventures with him, that, she can sort of thread that needle. And I don't know, I really enjoyed that. I think that aspect of her character and just their relationship overall is really what sells the movie for me. I like these characters, and I'm interested in the mystery like they are, and I'm interested in the development of their relationship and how that sort of echoes and plays out with Jimmy Stewart's own sort of, like, kind of asshole thoughts on marriage. Like, Thorwald is kind of the perfect foil in that Stewart wants to, go off and see the world and not be held down by, like, the old ball and chain. I mean, Thorwald literally kills his wife, who's, like, sick in bed, for pretty much the exact same reason. And that's something that, the character kind of has to silently reckon with. And you can see a lot of reflections in a lot of the kind of micro stories going on. And I think that's something that the movie does really well, and, like, that's what makes it probably one of my favorite movies, honestly.
Again, I don't have an issue with the relationship by any stretch of the imagination. I think my core grief with it is just how the ending gets executed from my perspective. Because I do agree with you. I think that the relationship is very strong. But when you spend most of the movie fretting mostly over whether these two are going to destroy their lives for something that is ultimately false. Like, I feel like the relationship itself takes a back seat to everything else that is going on. And you don't get the parallels between the wife murderer and main character guy. God, I am so fucking bad at names. It is not even funny. You don't get those parallels in the same way, though. I suppose there is kind of a difference in if the ending had gone off the way I was seeing it, where the parallels would still be there, albeit in a slightly different way, and that he is seeing something, his fears on how he could see the marriage going at that point. Like, you know, I am projecting my own insecurities and nerves onto this relationship that I don't know if it's actually there or not. I mean, the whole beginning of it is, you know, wives don't nag, they whatever now, at least in upper society, blah, 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 blah. And like that idea, it comes from him seeing everything from an outside perspective and not actually recognizing his own relationship. And so to have this idea being projected on something that isn't actually there, I think also would make the film more interesting in that regard. But I don't know. I am trying to fix one of the movie greats, and I am more than likely in the wrong on that side of things.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily that you're in the wrong. I think it's just that, like, you know, like I said at the beginning, I think that your point of view on the movie is just not like your point of view and the movie's point of view just can't really be reconciled. So Hitchcock, for what it's worth, another Hitchcock hallmark in like almost all of his movies, the police are not presented in a very good light. They're not like brutal monsters like they are in real life, but they are generally kind of incompetent buffoons. They're never any help. They always like dismiss the character's problems. North by Northwest is the best example of this, but even back as far as his films he was making in the 30s, the 39 Steps is like this too. So like authority figures are never presented in like the best sort of light, and that might be a thing that, again, just like depending on how much you know about Hitchcock, like it was so interesting to me when you said that you were on the detective side, because like in a vacuum and, you know, not having a, like, I can see how you got there, but you know, when I was watching the detective, I was like, oh yeah, here's the classic like Hitchcock, like, naysaying, like, authority figure, like, the detective isn't gonna do shit. It's all down to Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly, because the ethos of Hitchcock is very much, like, normal person against the world in a situation where people don't believe them. And, like, that's generally speaking, I'm sure that, you know, in the vast canon of Hitchcock movies, Hitchcock has as many movies as Stephen King has, like, fucking books. Guy made a lot of movies, so I'm sure you could find some exceptions to this.
I'm kind of happy that I didn't actually know that going in, because I think it provides a very interesting counterpoint to, I mean, the truth is what it boils down to, but death of the author, truth is subjective, all that good shit. So I think it raises a more interesting discussion going into this being like, why wouldn't I trust the cop in this film? It has given me no reason not to trust him other than he is a cop, and, you know, you shouldn't.
Yeah, and I think part of that is also just that I do wonder if, like, the expectation of, like, what the story was going to be like was impacting how you're reading a lot of the events, because from my perspective, we, in terms of visual language, like, whenever Thorwald is doing something shady, it is presented in the language of the film as something shady. Now, since you were approaching with the assumption that this was going to be a big misdirect, I could see how you got to that point. But on the other hand, when, you know, I watch a Hitchcock film, just knowing kind of his style, that is generally not an expectation that I typically have, that there is going to be like a big misdirect. He, like I said, kind of like Spielberg in that way, and that's very, very to the point, very kind of cut and dry sort of filmmaking. And that's not always the case. Psycho, I mean, one of the reasons I think Psycho's so interesting to talk about is that it deviates from Hitchcock's style in a big way, and it's his most famous film. But overall, like, Hitchcock, has even like spoken out, like the way he phrases it with the, bomb under the table thing is suspense versus surprise, and he always wants to go for suspense over like a shocking twist. Like, if you have all the cards on the table, then it's more tense for the viewer as long as they are invested in the characters. Now with this movie does have kind of a mystery element to it. Like, it does have that ambiguity, so I see your perspective on where that sort of comes through. But for me, that element was just like the little bit of doubt. Like, that little bit of doubt, like, oh, maybe Thorwald didn't do it, even though the visual language of the movie is overwhelmingly telling me that I think he did. So that just played to me as like just a little bit of doubt versus like, oh, okay, the movie is gonna pull the rug out from under me.
Yeah, I think that's the whole thing, is like I had the idea that this was Hitchcock is the master of suspense. And so I was very much zoning in on other areas, and like my suspense came more so. And like I feel like I was under suspense the entire fucking movie watching these two, as I said, slowly throw their lives away, in my opinion, or in my viewing experience. So like every time they did something, like my stomach was in knots, and I'm like, God, I fucking hate you two, you crazy idiots. Because I wanted them to not do this. Like I as I said, I liked them. So I didn't want them to throw their lives away to prove that this man killed his wife when it turned out he didn't. Like, that felt bad. And so like that's where my stomach was in knots, and why I really respected the hell out of the film, because I'm like, oh God, this is working really, really well on me. And then it turns out that, I mean, I was working really, really well on myself. And like, even then, I felt like the cards were all out on the table, because there was so many seeds of doubt planted, and like so many, what I saw as misdirections where things could go wrong. And I don't know, I was just expecting something so different than I got at the end there.
It's interesting, because the detective really is the key to all this, and that, like, I think that your reading of that character really makes or breaks it, because the detective, like, when you are following the movie's logic that, Hitchcock, fuck the police, basically, is that, like, the detective is like saying stuff. It's almost like gaslighting is kind of the intended effect, that like the detective is saying stuff that is contradicting what like you are seeing with your own eyes. And like that's a very common thing in Hitchcock films. Again, North by Northwest is all about this, in that like the world is kind of against you, and you do feel like you're crazy a little bit, even though like what you're seeing is what you're seeing, and the evidence is pretty compelling. It's just that, Hitchcock's very much a traditionalist. He wants his heroes to triumph in the end, and so I think that's just the. I think you have a really interesting perspective on this movie. It's not one that I've heard before. I think it's one that makes sense, especially given where you're coming from. But yeah, I think this is just a case of like, sometimes you in a movie just don't see eye to eye.
I mean, it's totally possible that like the police said a line of dialogue or something that I totally missed. Like I know at one point our main character makes a comment like he's cranky but he's good, that's why he's calling him, and it's like it's off the book. So I assumed that like what he was saying was accurate, and I never had a real reason to doubt what the movie was presenting. And when everything else was, kind of drawing me away from Thurgood killed his wife, I just kind of said, okay, the language of cinema is kind of misdirecting me that way. And, I think that had it ended with the twist of everything is pulling me that way, but just kidding, it was him, I would have been more on board. But because I felt like there were so many other interesting endings with this misdirection, I wasn't as on board. Like, I think that's really what it boiled down to, is the twist. Like, the idea of pulling someone away and setting up red herrings is as old as mysteries novels have ever been around. So, like, yeah, okay, I get why it's there, and I get that, like, the idea of the red herring, but none of these things feel like red herrings. They feel like more poignant thematic ideas existing outside of the scenes that we are watching to kind of pull in that direction. And like the final twist is going to be with Miss Lonely Hearts, and if there wasn't such a compelling alternative theme in my brain, I think I would have been way more involved with the movie. And like, I don't even know that it's necessarily all about the cop. I think the cop has a big role to play in it, but just having this alternative theme there that I think more jived with my worldview and was more challenging of my ideas that I wanted to see happen that just never came through was kind of, it pushed me away in a way that it didn't mean to.
And it do be like that sometimes.
It do. We good?
I think we good. I think we've said our piece. And yeah, now it's out there in the world. Now the listeners can, what do you stand for, listener? Decide here and now.
Well, you know what? Allow me to answer that, because I think in lieu of promotion, this is something that we were discussing on the fly because I didn't think about it. We should just say you should go donate instead. Don't follow us this week. Go instead donate to causes, bail funds of your local protesters, Black Lives Matter movements. There's tons of great threads out there that you should go donate to instead, because they need the money right now more than we do in a lot of ways. So go stand for that. Go stand for justice. Stand for justice, honestly.
Stand for justice. Don't feel like you can't do nothing, even if you're too afraid of, getting brutalized by the police, which is an understandable fear considering how many people are going blind because of like rubber bullets and stuff. You can still help. You can still take a stand. You can still donate your money and show your support in all sorts of ways. So find out what local things are happening in your area. Black Lives Matter has an organization, a website that you can donate to on a national level. There's lots of stuff you can do.
We'll throw some links in the description of the episode as well, and probably on Twitter as well. I don't normally do that. I'm bad about remembering these things, but this is important, so we're actually going to do that this time. We do need to say thank you to 25yearslatersite.com. There's a little button of us in the corner. You should go read and support them however you can. And also, we need to say thank you to Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It's Suicide, alternate take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. They're a wonderful band. You should also go support them however you can. Next week, we're going to continue with Hitchcock Month. It's going to be Psycho, right?
Psycho, yep.
I got it right that time. My brain didn't totally flake out on me there. So come back for us next week. Bye.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go